Today is the first day voters can cast ballots in that key battleground state of North Carolina. And if the early voting in Georgia earlier this week is any indication, the North Carolina polling stations will be busy indeed. The situation more complicated in North Carolina because so much of the western part of the state was devastated by Helene last month. And we're going to talk about that over the course of the next couple of hours. But there's a lot to discuss about North Carolina. Polling could not be tighter. So let me introduce you to a couple of special guests this morning, Skye David and Brian Lewis, two lobbyists who together host a weekly podcast in North Carolina called Do Politics Better. They are both in Raleigh for me this morning. A pleasure to meet you both, Skye, and welcome to you too, Brian. Glad to have you both on the program today.
Thanks for having us.
We're excited to be here.
Listen, I want to bring up the latest graphic we've been talking about this morning. The latest polling, 48-48. Things could not be tighter in your state. So let me ask you, first of all, Skye, what's your read on where the things in the race stand right now?
I think that poll you just cited is completely accurate. There are some polls that have Trump up one, some that have Vice President Harris up one. So it really looks to come down to turnout here.
Turnout, so ground game. Who has the better organization from that standpoint, do you think, Brian?
Right now, we're seeing a lot of energy coming from the Democratic Party. We have a very young state chair at the Democratic Party by the name of Anderson Clayton, and she has spent a lot of time, just about daily, it feels like, from her social media, out across all 100 counties organizing folks to vote. But don't count out the Republican ground game. They use a very traditional model where they have county chairs in all 100 counties, and those county chairs have precinct chairs. So it's a matter of kind of this young social media rally movement on the Democratic side. Republicans use a more old style approach. Both have been very effective in the past when executed well.
Okay, we'll see execution. Polling stations opening for that early voting in just a matter of 20 minutes or so, so we'll get an early indication. If we look at those numbers, though, Skye, 48-48, 96, that 4%, that remaining 4%, what do you think is going to determine where that 4% goes? The 4%, I guess, just that small group of voters going to determine who gets the 16 electoral college votes in your state.
I really think that that's an unknown right now. It's not a movable group of voters that are moved by one particular issue. All of our political researchers are saying, hey, that group, we do not know how to target them right now.
But in terms of key issues then, or key demographics even, Skye, how is the gender gap playing in North Carolina?
It's similar to all of the other states. I would say in North Carolina, you're going to see younger women identifying more with the Democratic Party, and maybe older women are going to identify more with the Republican Party, and white males identifying with the Republican Party as well.
And one of the things that we're also talking about, not just gender gap, but Brian, is also the education gap. There are dozens of really great colleges and universities in your state. Any read on the education gap and how that's affecting voter intention?
Yeah, the polls show this, and then past presidential campaigns are showing this. Going back to 2016, educated voters tend to vote the Democratic ticket. If you have a high school education or less, you are voting Republican. Now, I'm being very simplistic there in that, but that's what the polling is showing. And I'll say this, President Trump has done a remarkable job in our state of activating voters that have a high school diploma or less and are not voters in past elections. So if you go back to 2016 and before, these weren't voters that were coming to the polls. But President Trump has really tapped into them in our eastern part of the state and then the far western part of the state, which, by the way, was devastated by Helene. President Trump has a huge groundswell of support, especially among men.
I do think it's important to include that younger voters at the university level on campuses, whether or not they'll turn out for Vice President Harris is something up in the air. They weren't going to turn out for Biden, and so that really could make a difference here.
That's interesting. Again, the enthusiasm for the candidate. We'll maybe see that somewhat reflected in early voting, as we saw in Georgia. It was pretty record numbers in that particular state. So we'll get perhaps an early read on all of that. Brian, you mentioned Helene, and in the next hour, I'm going to have a full conversation with a reporter in North Carolina who's been out to some of these counties that have been so devastated and see how Helene is affecting things from his viewpoint. But since you raised it, what is your sense of how the storm, the aftermath to it, and how the recovery has been handled? How do you think this is going to play into the November 5th vote?
Yeah, I believe it is going to have an effect. It's going to make it more difficult for folks to vote in that part of the state. That is our mountain region, our western part of the state. But I don't count out the folks of western North Carolina. These are mountain people. They are resilient. They take their responsibility seriously as North Carolinians, as Americans who need to vote. And the state has done a lot last week and over at the governor's level and the General Assembly to make voting a little bit easier for folks in Western North Carolina. We also have in North Carolina about 2 weeks of early voting, and that is going to give folks an opportunity to vote early and to pre-register. So right now, if they're not registered to vote, if they vote during early voting, they can register and vote on the same day. And that's going to make it easier for those folks who've been affected by this devastating storm. Now, the recovery. I believe this is a once in a 1,000-year storm. There are things that are not going well, but I believe that FEMA, with state government and local government, they really are doing the best they can. And we've learned today that kids are going back to school. Universities in the western part of the state have resumed classes. And a lot of the municipalities that had no water now have water. We still have a long way to go, but we are recovering. We are very mountain strong in western North Carolina.
So the early voting tradition, we've been talking on our program this morning about how last vote 4 years ago, 2/3 of the ballots cast in North Carolina were done through early voting. There's a strong tradition there in North Carolina. Skye, what do you think in terms of what we're likely to see with the early voting public starting when they get a first crack at it 20 minutes from now?
Both sides are motivated this year, and I think that you're going to see high early voting numbers in North Carolina, similar to 2020. And I believe, like I said, it's a turnout game right now. But whether or not you're going to have that enthusiasm, it's there on both sides.
Heather, let me say this. Skye and I were at an event last week. It was a Republican-centric kind of event. And we heard Congressman Richard Hudson, the fifth most powerful legislator in Congress, say, Republicans, we have to early vote. This is something new that we're hearing out of our Republican Party here in North Carolina. They've been slow to embrace early voting. They've encouraged this year folks to get out and vote early. And I believe we're going to see more Republicans take advantage of the early voting opportunity.
That's interesting because I was just looking at some numbers. There's the University of Florida has an election lab, which is quite notable. Maybe you're familiar with the things that they've been finding. And they broke down votes requested for mail-in ballots, so the absentee ballots in North Carolina. And they were looking, obviously they don't know what the vote was for, but based on party registration, by far more Democrats had requested those advance mail-in ballots than Republicans have, by about 10%. So he was right, perhaps, to hone in on the need for the Republicans to get going on that. Why do you think that is, Brian?
Well, you know, Helene has shown North Carolina that anything can happen. And actually, Congressman Hudson mentioned that in his remarks. But I think the other thing is that in North Carolina, especially, we get our early voting numbers in right as soon as the polls close. So Tuesday, November 5th at 7:30, the early voting will come in. And Democrats usually win the early voting. And I think that Republicans are just like, we've got to get in the game. We can't unilaterally disarm. Early voting is here to stay, and we need to embrace it.
Okay. Skye, I'll give you the last word. It's looking so interesting, so tight in North Carolina. Between now and November the 5th, what do you think is going to be the issue that's going to solidify the vote behind that very small number who haven't yet decided which way they're going? What is going to be that key ballot box issue for voters on the 5th?
Sure. Like all elections before this, it is the economy. We are focused on the economy and what's going on as far as going to the grocery store, filling up your gas tank, those issues that affect your day-to-day American. That is the top of mind. Also, reproductive freedom, reproductive rights is top of mind for women in North Carolina.
So interesting to speak to you both. We'll be tuning in. Do Politics Better is the podcast which Skye and Brian co-host. Thank you for the time today and for your insights. We've appreciated it.
Thanks for having us, Heather.